When Mara Bell was 9, she learned that a promise could evaporate faster than rain on hot pavement. Her mother left her on a plastic stool outside the back door of a shuttered dumpling shop with 2 instructions: do not move and do not tell anyone your real name. The second instruction had always been useless. Mara did not know whether her real name was the one her mother used when she was gentle, the one the neighbors shouted when rent was late, or the one written in faded pencil on the back of an immunization card missing its stamp. So she held on to the first instruction instead. Do not move. She sat beneath the torn awning while buses hissed past, and the alley filled with the smell of frying oil and rain. Her mother had gone to borrow money, which in Mara's life could mean 10 minutes, 2 days, or a story that never came back. Mara waited until the noodle steam from the stall across the lane turned into dishwater in darkness, swallowed the shop signs one by one. She waited through the night traffic, then through the men unloading crates of beer at dawn. By the time the owner of the dumpling shop arrived, unlocking a door that had been closed, for months, Mara had learned a new rule as well. Some promises did not break with noise. They simply thinned out and disappeared. The owner was a woman named Mrs. Vale, who owned the 5 narrow rooms on the upper floor, and most of the gossip in Old Crane Lane. She recognized Mara at once. Everyone did. Mara was the child who collected bottles at dusk and read old homework sheets under street lamps after midnight. She was the daughter of Lydia Bell, a seamstress when sober, a dreamer when not, and a disaster in all seasons. Still here, Mrs. Vale huffed, climbing the steps with 3 keys, jangling at her waist. Your mother's gone, child. Don't sit here like a ghost. Mara did not answer. She had learned that silence was safer than pleading. Pleading made adults angry because it forced them to hear themselves say no. For a week she slept in the stairwell, outside the room her mother had rented. During the day she hauled cardboard and bottles to the recycling shed near the canal. At noon she drank water from the schoolyard tap and pretended she had somewhere to be. At night she spread flattened boxes under the top landing and tucked her shoes beneath her knees so no one could steal them. Mrs. Vale grumbled each time she passed, but left her alone as long as the stairwell stayed swept and no tenant complained. On the 8th day, a moving van backed into the lane. From the van came a wooden workbench, 3 metal cabinets, 6 long boxes stamped with the symbol of a clockmaker's guild, and finally a man with a rolled carpet on one shoulder and a face built entirely out of hard angles. He was neither drunk nor kind. That frightened Mara more than meanness would have. Mean people were predictable. Quiet people with careful hands never were. Mrs. Vale waddled up the stairs behind him, already talking.
Top room, same price as I told you.
The roof leaks only in the very heavy rains. There is a sink, hot water, if the boiler behaves, and enough space for all this, whatever it is. Tools, the man said. He had a voice like something left outside through winter rough, but clean. His name, Mara learned from the lease, was Jonas Reed. Mrs. Vale saw Mara at the landing and clicked. Her tongue. Ignore her. She is just waiting for a mother who is not coming back. Jonas looked once at Mara, then at the boxes piled by the wall. His gaze moved on as if she were another object in the stairwell, a bucket, a broom, a forgotten coat. The indifference stung more than disgust would have. She pulled her knees closer and tried to disappear. By evening, the old room that had once smelled of cheap perfume and instant noodles smelled instead of machine oil, cedar shavings, and the strange metallic sweetness of brass. Through the half-open door, Mara glimpsed gears laid out on cloth, hands from broken watches sorted in glass trays, and a lamp with a circular magnifier that made everything beneath it look important. A clock man, she thought. That night, the temperature dropped so sharply that the water in the cracked flower pots on the windowsill skinned over with ice. Mara shoved her hands into her sleeves and sat awake, teeth knocking softly together. She could hear the tick of at least 30 different clocks through Jonas Reed's door, some slow, some hurried, some proud enough to sound like shoes on marble. It was the warmest noise she had ever heard. By midnight, her fever had arrived. It began as a pinch behind her eyes, then settled into her bones and turned them to lit charcoal. She must have dozed off at some point, because when she opened her eyes, the stairwell was gone. She lay instead on a narrow sofa under a thick wool blanket with a bowl of broth on the floor beside her and a thermometer tucked beneath her arm. Jonas Reed stood at the sink rinsing a rag. You are awake, he said. Mara bolted upright too quickly, and the room spun. I can leave. You can stand first, he replied. Then you can make plans. She stared. Up close, his severity looked less like cruelty and more like exhaustion. He was older than she had first thought, not old but worn in the exact way that chairs at public libraries were worn by long use, not softness. There was a pale seam of a scar across one. Wrist. A pair of spectacles rested crookedly on his nose, and a loop hung on a cord around his neck. I do not steal, Mara blurted, and I do not talk in my sleep much.
Mrs. Vale
Says, I'm quiet.
I can sweep.
I can wash dishes. I can stay out of the way. Jonas set the rag aside.
Do.
You always bargain when you have a fever, Mara swallowed, only when it matters. For the first time, the corner of his mouth moved. It was not quite a smile.
Eat, he said, nudging the broth toward her.
Then sleep. We will discuss what to do with you in the morning. In the morning, he tried to send her to the municipal shelter. Mara stood at the threshold in his oversized spare socks and held herself straight. Please let me stay a week. Just a week.
I can work for it.
This is not a boarding house.
I know.
I work nights.
I know.
I do not like noise, lies, or people touching my tools.
I do not either.
Jonas rubbed a hand over his face. That last part is almost certainly false. Then, I can learn. He watched her for a long moment. Mara forced herself not to look away. This, she knew, was the moment in every bargain when adults decided whether you were a burden or an investment. Most of the time they chose burden. She was prepared for that. Still, when he finally spoke, the relief that hit her was so sudden it made her dizzy.
1 month, he said.
You sleep on the sofa until I find a proper cot. You go to school every day. You do not sort through my scrap bins without asking. You do not tell people I am your uncle, father, or savior. And if you break anything, you tell me before I discover
It myself.
Mara's mouth opened, closed, opened again.
That is all, she whispered.
No, Jonas.
Said, one more thing. In this house, we do not beg for permission to exist. Mara did not understand the rule then. Not really. It sounded too large to be useful. But she repeated it to herself all day while sweeping metal. Dust from beneath the workbench and separating clock keys by size. We do not beg for permission to exist. It felt like trying on a coat tailored for someone taller, stronger, and made of better materials. Even so, she kept it. Jonas Reed repaired tower clocks for churches, government, buildings, and the railway station on North Harbor Road. He left at dusk with a canvas bag of tools and returned, close to dawn, smelling of cold iron and the city's wet rooftops. During the day, he slept in his room or worked at the bench while Mara sat cross-legged at the opposite end of the table doing homework on paper so old the backs still carried other children's arithmetic. Sometimes he spoke for hours about nothing. Sometimes he did not speak at all. Mara learned his routines before she learned his temper. Tea at 7, bread at noon, silence when a spring was under tension. Never stack brass against steel. Never place a clock on its face. Never say almost right when precision was required. Within a month, she could tell by the sound alone whether a carriage clock needed oil or a mainspring. Within 3, she knew which customers would underpay. Unless handed an invoice with their own mistakes itemized in red, Jonas never praised her directly, but he stopped, rechecking the screws after she polished and sorted them. In his house, that counted as trust. School was harder. Municipal number 7 was not cruel by design. It was simply efficient in the way institutions often are. With poor children, quick to categorize, slow to revise, Mara arrived thin, awkward, and dressed in donated clothes that never quite matched. Her notebooks were neat but sparse. She spoke only when called on. She smelled faintly of oil from the workshop, no matter how carefully she scrubbed her hands. Children noticed such things the way crows noticed.
Shine.
They called her Scrap Sparrow, Clock Rat, Tower Ghost. At recess, she sat under the back staircase and copied math problems from the teacher's board onto salvaged paper because she could not afford the extra workbook. When the winter exams were posted, she placed second in mathematics, fifth in literature, and first in science. That last achievement was invisible, but hard-earned. The person who finally interrupted it was Ms. Ellen Park, the mathematics teacher with blunt bangs, blunt shoes, and a patience so exact it felt engineered. She caught Mara rewriting an entire test paper by hand. After class, because one corner of the original had torn. Why did not you ask for a new sheet, Ms. Park asked. Mara looked down. Paper costs money. Park stared at her for a second too long. Then she pulled a chair out, sat beside her, and said, "No, child. In this room, paper costs honesty and effort, both of which you appear able to pay." It was the beginning of many things. Park recommended Mara for the district's Saturday problem-solving club, which was free only if one pretended not to see the transport cost. Jonas solved that by changing his routes and dropping her at the central library on his way to service the courthouse clock. There, under a stained glass dome and the dry smell of old bindings, Mara discovered a kingdom made entirely of explanations. She learned quickly that talent was a poor word for what people really meant. What they called talent, she found, was often merely time no one
Had stolen from you.
She had almost none, so she manufactured it. She borrowed dawn by waking at 4 to study before school. She borrowed transit by doing vocabulary. Drills while riding with Jonas in the repair van. She borrowed failure by copying the solution sets of older students and solving them again until the errors felt familiar enough to avoid. When she ran out of notebooks, she wrote in the margins of discarded wall calendars. When she ran out of courage, she counted backward from 100 and began anyway. Jonas noticed before anyone else how her hunger had changed. In the early months, she ate like a frightened stray, fast and grateful and defensive. By spring, she ate like a worker with plans. What now, he asked one morning when she spread a hand-drawn budget beside her bowl of porridge. Competition fees, Mara said, and bus fare. And if I save enough after that, maybe a second-hand graphing calculator. You are 11.
Exactly, she said.
I'm behind. He frowned in the direction of her columns. By whose measure, Mara almost said everyone's. Instead, she shrugged and sipped her porridge. Jonas reached over, took her pencil, crossed out 2 of the rows and replaced them with 1. Food. She made a face. That is not a competition. It is if you are fighting your own body every week. He was right, infuriatingly. Park agreed, so Mara negotiated a new arrangement with herself. No skipping lunch to save money, no pretending. Dizziness was normal, and no turning every coin into future proof that she deserved to stay where she had landed. It was her first real lesson in maintenance. Surviving, Jonas liked to say, was just repair performed in time. The first money Mara ever earned legally, and proudly came from clocks. Not the important clocks. Not the tower giants with bronze bells and public faces, the little discarded ones, alarm clocks with dented cases, schoolhouse wall, clocks abandoned after budget replacements, kitchen timers with sticky hands. Jonas let her take apart the hopeless pieces. From the scrap bin, as long as she kept notes, she cleaned, cataloged, and slowly learned to combine 2 broken bodies into 1 functioning heart. Mrs. Vale, who knew the appetite of the neighborhood better than any merchant, offered her a folding table near the Sunday market. Call it something sentimental, she advised. People buy more when they think they are rescuing an object. Mara painted a sign that read second morning clocks. The first day she sold 3, the second, 5. By the end of the summer, she had enough saved for competition fees, a second-hand calculator with a missing rubber foot, and a blue cotton cot Jonas assembled by the window where the first light of morning crossed the blanket in a long gold bar. When he finished tightening the last bolt, he stepped back, wiped his hands on a rag, and said, "Now you look less temporary." It should not have felt like a blessing. It did. There was one winter during Mara's second year with Jonas when Old Crane Lane lost power for nearly 18 hours after sleet brought down 2 neighborhood transformers. The adults cursed the cold, the shopkeepers cursed lost inventory, and the children treated the darkness as a holiday until their breath started smoking indoors. Mara sat in the workshop wrapped in 2 sweaters, watching Jonas dismantle emergency lanterns and rewire them so the elderly tenants could carry light from room to room. Why are we doing this for free? She asked through chattering teeth. Because Mrs. Vale will triple the rent if they survive. To pay it? Jonas said. That is not noble. It is not meant to be. But when they finished the lanterns, he carried them door to door himself. Mara followed with a crate of batteries and learned another principle that never appeared in textbooks. Sometimes the line between generosity and obligation existed only for people warm enough to argue about it. That night, they boiled water on a camping stove and spread blankets over the stair rail to trap heat. Mrs. Vale, pretending outrage at everyone's incompetence, fed the whole floor lentil soup made from pantry remnants. Mara did multiplication by flashlight while Jonas adjusted the pendulum of a dead hallway clock so that even without electricity, the building could still hear the hour. In the morning, when the power returned, Mara understood that infrastructure was not abstract. It was whether old men woke on time for medication, whether frozen pipes burst, whether a child studied or shivered. A week later, she wrote an essay about the outage for school. Park entered it in a municipal civic writing contest without asking permission. Mara won second prize and $70. She used 68 of them to buy a used reference atlas of bridges and drainage systems and spent the remaining 2 on sesame candy for everyone in the building, including Mrs. Vale, who sniffed and declared it too sweet while eating 3 pieces. At 12, Mara won the district mathematics challenge. At 13, she placed nationally in a mechanics essay competition after submitting a paper about public clocks as the moral architecture of a city. At 14, she built a water level alarm for the Old Canal District using salvage wire, bicycle reflectors, and a speaker Jonas claimed had died in 1987. The design was ugly, clever, cheap, and effective. The city's flood committee ignored it for 6 months and then adopted a version of it after the autumn rains nearly drowned 3 basement shops. Newspapers came, so did problems. Mara's mother, who had been a ghost for years, suddenly reappeared as rumor before she ever reappeared as flesh. Someone had seen Lydia Bell in South Terminal with a man who sold fake pharmaceuticals. Someone else swore she had 2 more children now.
Mrs.
Vale heard a third version in which Lydia had become religious, rich, or dead, depending on the weather and the teller. Jonas never mentioned any of it. Mara pretended not to care until one evening she cracked a crystal face while polishing it and cut her thumb on the shard. Blood welled up bright and abrupt. She stared at it and said, in the flat voice she reserved for the worst truths if she came back, "Tomorrow, I think I would still open the door." Jonas set down the regulator clock he had been adjusting. "That is the unremarkable tragedy of being a child," he said. "Loving people long after they have failed the job." Mara did not cry. She wrapped her thumb in tape and finished polishing the clock. But that night, she moved her cot closer to the wall that separated her room from his workshop, and he did not comment. By the time she entered high school, Mara Bell had become a small local oddity, the scrap girl who solved Olympiad problems on butcher paper, the apprentice, clockmaker who spoke at city youth forums without glancing at her notes, the student who somehow ranked first in physics and literature while still working the Sunday stall. Old Crane Lane began to boast about her as if it had invented her. Municipal number 7 no longer treated her as a category. It treated her as an exception. That was better in some ways and worse in others. Teachers displayed her exam papers as examples. Parents of other students requested her study schedules. Younger children followed her to the library and asked if genius hurt. "Only when I am awake," she told them. Her high school years would have been nearly clean had bureaucracy not remembered her. When Mara tried to register for the national qualifying exams that opened paths toward the top engineering universities, the office clerk frowned at her file for so long that Ms. Park crossed the room. "What is it?" the teacher asked. The clerk pushed the folder aside. "Her birth registration is inconsistent. Her mother used 2 surnames in different districts. There is no verified paternal record. The residential transfer was provisional. She may need special review." Special review, Mara learned, was a phrase adults used when they wanted to turn a child into paperwork. For 3 months, the matter sat in gray trays and traveled through offices with failing fluorescent lights. Each time Mara thought it settled, another stamped request arrived asking for a document that did not exist. Lydia Bell could not be found. The clinic where Mara had first been vaccinated had closed after a fire. The shelter that had briefly recorded her case had lost half its archives to mold. Officially speaking, Mara was less a person than an argument about whether one could prove a life by the evidence of its continuance. Park fought with phone calls. Mrs. Vale fought with gossip, which was often more effective. Jonas fought with receipts. He brought tax records, school fee slips, electricity bills, letters from customers who had known Mara for years, and a spiral notebook in which he had recorded every expense from the day she entered his room, feverish and furious. Food, medicine, uniforms, exam fees, tram cards, notebook refills, winter boots, soldering iron tips, geometry set, umbrella, breakfast on March 11 after district contest. "You kept all this?" Mara asked, stunned. Jonas did not look up from the pages. "Keeping time is my profession." That, too, counted as love, though she was nearly old enough before she could name it. At last, the review board granted her full registration status. The email arrived at 2:14 in the morning while Jonas was calibrating a station clock and Mara was halfway through a set of differential equations. She read it once, twice, 3 times, then stood up so fast her chair overturned. "I exist," she said, which was not the most elegant response, but the truest. Jonas took the paper from her hand, adjusted his glasses, and grunted. "I have been telling you that for years." She laughed so hard she cried. Then, because laughter and crying had become less enemies by then, she did both until dawn. When success came, it did not arrive as a
Fanfare.
It came as compression. The top-scoring students in the region were funneled into camps, mock exams, interviews, contests, recommendation panels, summer intensives, and more mock exams. Mara's world narrowed to whiteboards, train timetables, annotated formulas, and the careful management of energy. She stopped counting days and counted instead how many correct answers stood between her and the future. Jonas's hands began to tremble that winter. Only a little, only when he held the smallest screws or tried to reset the jeweled escapements on travel watches. He blamed cold, then caffeine, then age, though he was not yet old enough for any of those excuses to be persuasive. Mara noticed because she noticed everything that threatened the machinery she loved. You dropped 3 screws today, she said one evening. Jonas reached for the kettle too quickly. I dropped 2.
You missed the point.
No, he said.
Pouring tea.
I refined it. She waited. He did not elaborate. The truth came from Dr. Ammon, the clinic physician who treated half the district's old tradesmen and all of their lies. Jonas had nerve damage in his right hand, likely from years of fine repetitive work aggravated by cold and untreated inflammation. Surgery might help. Rest certainly would. Neither option pleased him. Rest from what? He snapped in the exam room. Eating, Mara, sitting beside him with a notebook open, asked the only useful question. How expensive? Afterwards, she went home, opened the ledger she had kept since the first day of the Sunday market, and began making a new plan. She did not tell Jonas that she took on extra students for tutoring. She did not tell him she sold her old competition medals for their material value until Ms. Park discovered it and bought them back from the second-hand dealer herself. She did not tell him that she applied for a municipal innovation grant using the canal alarm prototype and spent 3 sleepless nights polishing the proposal in the school computer lab. The grant committee, perhaps swayed by her design or perhaps by the startling severity of her presentation, awarded her enough not only to build a pilot program, but to cover Jonas's surgery deposit. When she slid the acceptance letter across the workbench, Jonas read it and said nothing for so long that she feared something had gone wrong. Then he removed his glasses, cleaned them with the edge of his shirt, though they were not dirty, and said, "You should have been impossible."
Probably, Mara said softly.
His eyes stayed on the paper. I mean it as praise. I? No. The surgery helped, not perfectly, but enough. Jonas could no longer do the most microscopic restoration work for hours on end, yet he could teach, supervise, estimate, and, on good mornings, still reset the giant pendulum in the North Harbor station clock without missing the beat. Mara shifted more and more of the bench work to herself. Customers adjusted. Some left, muttering that the old master had gone soft. Others stayed because the apprentice, now taller and sharper and always 10 minutes ahead of the obvious solution, was becoming famous in her own right. The year Mara turned 17, she was invited to the National Youth Forum on Public Infrastructure. The invitation alone was absurd enough to make Mrs. Vale frame the envelope. Mara spoke about neglected systems, clocks, drains, schools, shelters, and all the invisible mechanisms that failed first for the poor. She argued that cities revealed their ethics not by monuments, but by maintenance. The speech went online. Thousands watched it, then hundreds of thousands. A publisher asked if she would write essays. A television program asked if she would appear on a panel. Jonas, who distrusted cameras the way cats distrusted cucumber slices, said absolutely not. Why not? Mara asked. Because attention is expensive, he said. And the bill rarely arrives while you are still looking. She thought he was being dramatic until her mother actually came back. Lydia Bell appeared on a Thursday in April wearing a coat too thin for the season and lipstick too bright for morning. She stood in the workshop doorway like a debt, demanding acknowledgement. Mara recognized her immediately, though the recognition felt less like home and more like stepping on rotten wood. Mara, her mother said, trying the name as though testing whether it still fit. You have gotten tall. Mrs. Vale, who had spotted her from the landing and arrived within 30 seconds under the pretense of returning a sugar bowl, leaned against the frame with her arms crossed. Jonas remained seated at the bench, not touching anything. Mara set down the mainspring she had been measuring. What do you want? Lydia laughed too brightly.
Is that?
How you greet your mother, it depends, Mara replied. Is this how a mother returns? For a moment something ugly surfaced in Lydia's face, shame, anger, calculation. Mara could not tell. It smoothed over almost at once. I heard about you, Lydia said. The speeches, the prizes. I always knew you would amount to something. You got your stubbornness from me. Mrs. Vale snorted so rudely that Lydia flinched. The conversation did not take long after that. Lydia wanted money. Not much, she claimed, only enough to settle a temporary problem. She mentioned sacrifice, bad luck, impossible men, and the ungratefulness of the world. She never once mentioned the night under the awning or the years in between. When Mara refused, Lydia's mouth hardened. So that is it, she said. You get one decent room and suddenly you think you're better than blood. No, Mara answered. I got one decent room and learned blood is not the
Measure.
Lydia left with her pride intact and nothing else. Mara expected to shatter afterward, or at least to ache in some newly reopened place. Instead, she felt only fatigue, like the day after dismantling a complicated machine and confirming that the missing part had never been there. Jonas waited until the sound of her mother's steps faded completely. You did well. Mara stared at the door. I do not feel well. That is different, he said. She turned, crossed the workshop in 3 strides, and hugged him so hard his loop knocked against her forehead. "What was that for?" he asked, startled. "For the room," she said, into his shoulder. "For not making me beg." He stood very still. Then, awkwardly, but with growing certainty, he put his arms around her back. What finally made their strange household official was not sentiment, but a broken arm. Mara was 15 when a classmate slipped on the station steps after school and fell into the path of a luggage cart. Mara yanked him clear and took the cart's full metal corner against her forearm. The fracture was clean, the pain obscene, and the paperwork afterward even worse. The hospital asked for parent signatures. The school asked for guardianship. Confirmation for insurance purposes. Mara, high on pain medicine and indignation, informed the admissions clerk that if being alive in the same room for 6 years did not count as family, then the government's definition was badly machined. Jonas said nothing in the cab home. 2 weeks later, he returned from City Hall with a folder thick enough to stun a horse. He had begun formal guardianship proceedings. "You can still say no," he told Mara, setting the folder on the kitchen table as if it were a trap that might spring. "It won't change the room, or the school, or anything practical, really. It only prevents offices from acting surprised that I am the one who shows up." Mara stared at the application forms. On the top page, under proposed legal guardian, stood his name in deliberate block letters, Jonas Elias Reed. "You hate offices," she said. "I do." "You hate forms." "Correct. And you're doing this voluntarily." His expression warned her away from making too much of it. Naturally, she ignored the warning. "At least admit," she said, voice shaking in spite of herself, "that you would miss me if someone else tried to take me." Jonas leaned back in his chair. "Mara, if someone else tried to take you, the resulting paperwork would be the least of their problems." That was not exactly yes. It was, in fact, much better. The hearing was brief. Mrs. Vale appeared in a purple hat and testified that while Jonas was unbearable, over-caffeinated, and prone to speaking to clocks as though they were apprentices, he had fed, housed, educated, and protected the girl more faithfully than most blood relations managed. Park submitted letters about academic progress. Dr. Ammon provided medical records. The magistrate, who had clearly expected neglect and instead found evidence tabbed by month and color-coded in Jonas's dreadful handwriting, granted the petition in under 20 minutes. On the courthouse steps, Mara held the new documents so tightly the folder bent. "Well?" Jonas asked.
Well, what? You are officially difficult.
To remove any comment, Mara threw one arm around his waist before the cast on the other could stop her. "Yes," she said. "Try not to look so pleased." He looked scandalized. "I never look pleased." Mrs. Vale, climbing down the courthouse steps behind them, barked a laugh loud enough to startle pigeons into flight. At 18, Mara Bell sat for the National University entrance exams, not because she needed them. Her recommendation path to North Meridian University was already probable, but because she wanted a score with edges. She wanted a number no one could talk around, explain away, or treat as charity. When the results came, she placed first in the province in mathematics, third overall in the engineering track, and decisively inside the threshold for North Meridian, the country's most elective science and engineering institution, and, in Mara's imagination, the city-sized embodiment of every bridge she had ever wanted to cross. Old Crane Lane erupted. Mrs. Vale bought fireworks illegally and set them off in the alley with a saucepan on her head for protection. Park cried openly and then denied it. The district mayor sent flowers. 3 separate newspapers misquoted Mara's remarks about infrastructure and made her sound more inspirational than she actually felt. The best moment was quieter. That evening, after the visitors left and the alley returned to its usual chorus of scooters and arguments, Jonas climbed with her to the roof of the old building carrying 2 enamel mugs of tea. The station clock in the distance glowed gold. Against the dark, somewhere below them, Mrs. Vale was telling a neighbor for the 9th time that she had always known the girl was extraordinary, although Mara clearly remembered being called a stairwell ghost for at least a year. Jonas handed her a mug. "North Meridian," he said.
You aimed low?
Mara laughed, terrifyingly low. He reached into his jacket and produced a flat box wrapped in brown paper. Inside lay a fountain pen with a brass clip shaped like a tiny clock hand. The barrel was engraved with a line she recognized from the sign over her old market table. Second morning, she looked up. "You will need something proper to sign with," Jonas said. "University forms, grant proposals, patent documents when you become intolerable." Mara ran her thumb over the engraving. "This is expensive." "So was your school." "Registration," he replied. "Yet, here we are." She wanted to say thank you, but the phrase was too small and too used, so she set the box down carefully and asked the question that had lived in her for years, growing heavier the closer she came to leaving. "Will you be all right if I go, Jonas?" Took a long sip of tea. "No," he said. But that is not an argument. The answer hurt and healed her in the same breath. At North Meridian, Mara studied civil systems engineering, urban data, and anything else that helped her understand why some places held while others collapsed. She worked in labs where sensors could read the stress in bridges and in studios where graduate students argued about housing policy at 2 in the morning with the moral arrogance unique to the gifted and sleep deprived. She felt poor there in new ways and rich in
Others.
rich in endurance, rich in clarity, rich in the ability to survive embarrassment, which turned out to be a form of capital many brilliant people lacked. She never stopped sending money home. Not to her mother. To Jonas, who pretended to resent it and deposited every transfer into a business account named Morning Repairs and Public Works because, as he wrote in one email, if you insist on behaving like a financier, I will act accordingly. Together across distance, they built something larger than either had intended. The canal alarm pilot became a full flood monitoring network for 3 districts. The Sunday clock stall turned into a restoration workshop. Employing 2 apprentices from the vocational school and 1 widow, Mrs. Vale swore could out-negotiate customs officers. With Ms. Park and the old district library, Mara started a scholarship and study room for children who needed somewhere warm before dawn and after dark. They named it the Borrowed Morning Room. The first winter, it opened. 12 children enrolled. The second, 31. By the time Mara finished university, the city planning office wanted her. So did 2 consulting firms. So did a technology company whose salary offer made Mrs.
Vale.
momentarily forget all previous moral positions on capitalism. Mara chose none of them at first. Instead, she accepted a fellowship to design low-cost civic monitoring systems for underfunded districts and rural schools. The work took her back to places that looked painfully like the roads outside the village where her mother had first learned to survive badly. On one of those trips, she stood in a mountain county school, watched girls copy chemistry formulas under dim lights, and understood with embarrassing force that the future was not a ladder. It was a relay. Someone had carried her when she was 2, cold to walk. Her task now was not gratitude. It was continuity. Jonas grew older while pretending not to. He stopped climbing tower stairs alone. Mara installed remote calibration sensors in 3 of his largest city contracts so he could diagnose faults from the workshop before sending younger technicians up with the tools. He complained bitterly the entire time about software, batteries, modernity, and her tendency to improve things without permission. When reporters came to interview the famed engineer whose designs were being used in flood control systems, school alert networks, and public timing infrastructure across several provinces, Mara insisted on doing at least 1 interview in the workshop on Old Crane Lane. Why here, the producer asked, glancing at the narrow room and its eccentric army of clocks, because Mara said, this is where time was first given. Back to me. The clip went viral in exactly the way Jonas hated. Viewers became obsessed with the Gruff Clockmaker in the background who corrected her terminology. From off-camera and muttered that pendulums were not vibes no matter what the subtitles claimed, he accidentally acquired admirers. Teenagers began mailing him sketches. Retired engineers sent letters. Someone made fan art of him as a stern, mechanical wizard. He threatened legal action against Olive, them, and secretly saved 3 prints in a drawer. Years later, when the city finally approved a major restoration of the old station tower and its surrounding square, Mara insisted that Jonas serve as chief historical consultant. You are 40 years too modern to appreciate the mechanism, he told the municipal board. You restored it for 30 years, Mara replied.
That is the
Definition of historical. They worked side by side through the autumn. The bronze bell was cleaned.
The
Escapement rebuilt. The old face relit. Sensors tucked invisibly into the frame allowed the system to report drift, humidity, and structural stress. Ancient precision and modern warning. Married without either admitting defeat. On the morning, the restored station clock resumed service. Half the district turned out.
Mrs.
Vale wore a hat aggressive enough to count as architecture. Park brought former students. Children from the borrowed morning room held paper flags and shouted every time the minute hand moved, which was both inaccurate and deeply enthusiastic. The mayor made a speech too long for the weather. Mara followed with one short enough to be believed. Then Jonas, under pressure from everyone, including 3 television crews and 1 appalling number of schoolchildren, stood before the microphone. He stared at the crowd as if considering whether silence might yet save him. I fix clocks, he said at last. That used to seem like enough. Then one winter, a girl turned up in my stairwell, and it became obvious. The city had more broken things than gears. The crowd laughed softly. Jonas adjusted his glasses. People think repair is sentimental. It is not. Repair is practical. It means deciding a thing matters enough to keep from failing. A clock, a building, a child. Sometimes you do not know what you are, preserving until much later. Mara did not move. If she moved, she might start crying in public, and then Mrs. Vale would cry, and then Ms. Park would, and nothing good ever came from giving sentiment a quorum. Jonas cleared his throat once. That is all, he muttered, but the square erupted anyway. When the bell struck noon, the sound rolled over the lane, the library roof, the market stalls, and the roof of the building where Mara had once waited under an awning for a promise to return. The old top-floor room no longer existed. The block had been renovated years before. Yet from the square, she could still find the place where the stairwell window had once thrown a sliver of light onto her blanket of cardboard. She stood there after the ceremony, just long enough for the crowd to drift away. Jonas came to stand beside her without comment. "It is strange," Mara said.
I used to think everything
Depended on being chosen. By a mother. By a school. By luck. By whoever had the keys. And now, she looked at the restored clock, at the square full of children, at the library dome glinting. Beyond the station tracks, at the workshop sign reading morning repairs in gold paint that had begun as a joke and turned into a life. "Now I think choosing matters more," she said. "Choosing what to keep. Choosing where to stand. Choosing who gets warmth." Jonas grunted approval.
better theory.
She smiled. "I had a good teacher." He glanced at her sideways. "Mediocre. Overrated. Bad at compliments." That part is true. The wind shifted, carrying autumn leaves against their shoes. Across the square, a group of girls from the scholarship room were arguing over a geometry problem while sharing sesame bread. One of them looked up, recognized Mara, and waved so violently that she nearly dropped the bread. Mara raised a hand in return. She was no longer the child beneath the awning, no longer the feverish girl bargaining for a place. On a stranger's sofa, no longer even the student who believed excellence alone could purchase safety. She had become something less fragile and more demanding than those versions of herself. She had become a keeper of mornings, a maintainer, a witness, someone who understood that rescue was rarely a single, dramatic act and almost always 1,000 stubborn repairs. That evening, before she left for a planning meeting about expanding the borrowed morning program into 3 more districts, Mara placed a small object on Jonas's workbench. It was a brass key, polished to a soft gold mounted in a wooden frame. He frowned. "What is this?" "The first clock key you ever trusted."
"Me to sort," she said.
"You told me not to lose it, so I did not." He picked up the frame, stared at it, and for once seemed to have no immediate correction ready. "This is sentimental nonsense." "It is," Mara agreed. "Try surviving it." Jonas set the frame down with absurd care. "Get out of my workshop." Mara laughed, kissed his rove cheek before he could dodge, and headed for the door. Behind her, 100 clocks ticked in. Imperfect agreement. Ahead of her, the city waited its drains, schools, bridges, warning lights, and hungry children. Its failures, its deadlines, its stubborn possibilities. She had work to do and enough mornings now to
Share.
Outside, the restored station bell began to ring. Mara looked up, smiled into the clear autumn light, and walked toward the sound.